There's a quiet moment, often unnoticed, when the noise of life pauses just enough for us to hear something else, something older than our ambitions, deeper than our desires. It is not the voice of the world, with its endless invitations to chase and to compete. It is the whisper of a question we cannot name, but which lingers beneath every success and every disappointment. We first feel it as restlessness, as if the life we are living were slightly out of alignment with the one meant for us. Modern culture tells us this is a problem to be solved with more achievement, more experiences, more possessions. Yet the more we add, the more we feel the faint echo of something missing. This is not a flaw in us, it is an invitation. The Urantia Book speaks of life as a stage in a vast cosmic journey, where each soul is drawn forward by a purpose greater than itself. Alan Watts called it the game of life, but a game we misunderstand when we believe the goal is to simply win by collecting trophies. And Rumi, centuries before, reminded us that what you seek is seeking you, as if to say that this longing is not a weakness but a compass. The silent crisis of our age is not that we have too little, but that we have mistaken the nature of what we truly need. We have built entire economies on the promise that happiness can be packaged, purchased, and preserved, and we exhaust ourselves in pursuit of it. Byung-Chul Han calls this the burnout society, a culture where we do not collapse under oppression, but under our own relentless self-exploitation in the name of fulfillment. And yet, somewhere in the gaps between our appointments, our scrolling, and our carefully curated smiles, there is that quiet voice again, asking if this is all there is. We try to ignore it, because to listen might require us to dismantle parts of our life that seem essential. But ignoring it does not silence it. On the contrary, the more we resist, the louder it becomes in the moments when our guard is down, in the stillness before sleep, in the pause between conversations, in the space left by a dream that didn't deliver what we thought it would. If we dare to follow that voice, even a little, it begins to reveal something both unsettling and beautiful. That happiness is not the final destination, but the fragrance that follows when we walk toward a deeper freedom. The true purpose, hidden in plain sight, is not to endlessly chase after the glimmers on the horizon, but to turn and face the source of our dissatisfaction. The Buddha's insight, echoed in the cosmic perspective of Urantia, is that liberation from suffering, not the accumulation of pleasure, is the great work of a human life. To hear this may feel like a stripping away, as though we are being asked to surrender the very thing we have been taught to want. But in truth, it is an opening. For beyond the mirage of more lies a stillness that holds everything, a vastness where love, meaning, and peace are no longer conditions to be met, but the air we breathe. And once you catch even a glimpse of it, the chase will no longer satisfy you, because you will have begun to remember that you were never meant to live in pursuit of shadows. You were meant to walk in the light that has always been within you. We are taught from childhood that the aim of life is to be happy, as if happiness were a fixed destination, a summit from which the view is perfect and permanent. Every cultural signpost seems to point toward it. The smiling faces in advertisements, the carefully framed stories on social media, the subtle assumption that if we arrange our lives just right, the feeling we long for will finally settle in and stay. Yet beneath this narrative lies a truth we seldom dare to face, that the moment happiness arrives, it already begins to slip away. We clutch at it like water in our hands, only to feel it leak through our fingers. Schopenhauer described this restless state as the will, a ceaseless striving that creates suffering precisely because it can never be fully satisfied. The metaphor of the bucket with a hole is apt. No matter how much joy, success, or pleasure we pour in, it drains out, and we are left needing to refill it again. The hedonic treadmill, as psychologists call it, turns endlessly under our feet. We walk or run, but we do not truly get anywhere. And yet, we keep moving because stopping feels too much like surrender. Modern life has perfected this treadmill into something almost invisible. We see not only our own desires, but also the curated highlights of everyone else's lives. Each image or story is a subtle reminder that there is more we should be doing, achieving, becoming. Aristotle spoke of eudaimonia, a flourishing that comes from living virtuously. But in the digital age, the vision of flourishing has been replaced by a performance of happiness. We scroll through images of vacations, celebrations, and triumphs, rarely pausing to remember that these moments are fragments, carefully chosen to tell a story that hides as much as it reveals. The psychologist Iris Moss has shown that the more we chase happiness as a goal, the less happy and more isolated we often become, because the act of chasing keeps us aware of the gap between what we have and what we want. Viktor Frankl, who saw life stripped of every comfort, understood this paradox deeply. Happiness, he said, is not to be pursued directly, but allowed to happen as a byproduct of living with meaning. When meaning is absent, the chase becomes desperate, and even our successes taste hollow. The illusion is not just that happiness can be permanent, but that it can be manufactured through accumulation, status, or comparison. From a mystical perspective, this pursuit is like trying to capture the reflection of the moon in a lake, forgetting that the light itself does not reside in the water. Hermetic teachings speak of illusion as a veil drawn over the eyes of the seeker, a necessary stage that provokes the deeper question: what is real beneath the appearance? When we measure our worth by how closely our lives resemble the images we consume, we mistake the reflection for the source and the chase for the journey. This is why the bucket with a hole is such a haunting metaphor. We can pour in all the pleasures of the world, but if the vessel itself is flawed, nothing will remain. The task is not to find more water, but to mend the vessel, to turn our attention from the constant inflow toward the quiet work of sealing what leaks. Only then can joy, meaning, and peace begin to settle without rushing away. And this shift, subtle but profound, begins with the recognition that the endless race toward happiness is not the road to fulfillment, but the very pattern that keeps us from it. Desire often disguises itself as the pursuit of joy, but if we look closely, much of what we call seeking pleasure is in truth an attempt to escape discomfort. The Buddha's words in the Siddhartha Sutta are like a lantern in this darkened room of the mind. The untrained person, when touched by pain, whether it is the sting of loneliness, the restlessness of boredom, or the weight of anxiety, reflexively grasps for sensual pleasure as the only imaginable relief. We imagine ourselves moving towards something radiant, yet our steps are often away from something we cannot bear to feel. Alan Watts suggested that acceptance is the only true transformation, but acceptance is the very thing desire avoids. Carl Jung would remind us that the parts of ourselves we refuse to face, the shadow, will rule us from beneath the surface, shaping our longings in ways we do not understand. We hunger not only for the sweetness of life, but for the cessation of the bitter taste already in our mouths. And so we mistake the pause in pain for the presence of true happiness. The nature of dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, is that it is woven into all conditioned experiences. It is not only the sharp edge of loss, but also the dull ache that follows fulfillment. The truth that even our most cherished joys are impermanent. This is the suffering of change. The delight of a cool breeze becomes discomfort when it turns to wind. The satisfaction of hunger shifts to pain when we overeat. The analogy of scratching an itch reveals the pattern clearly. Without the itch, scratching would bring no pleasure. It might even wound us. But because the itch is there, the scratch feels like bliss for a moment. And then the itch returns, or another appears, and the cycle resumes. In addiction studies, this is understood as the turn from seeking a high to simply avoiding a low. Yet this cycle exists far beyond substance use. It is in the way we reach for our phones in silence, how we seek the approval of others when self-doubt arises, how we work ourselves to exhaustion to outrun the thought that we are not enough. The Urantia perspective sees desire as a mechanism of an imperfect evolutionary sphere, a force meant to drive growth, but one that, without wisdom, traps us in repetitive striving. This is the paradox. The same energy that can lead us toward the divine can also hold us in a loop of longing and dissatisfaction. If we watch the mind closely, we begin to see desire not as a straight line toward an object, but as a wave retreating from an unseen shore of discomfort. Each crest promises a destination, yet the motion is always away from what we do not wish to touch. The oceanic pull of this pattern keeps us half asleep, as Gurdjieff described, living in a state of mechanical reaction rather than conscious choice. To awaken is to pause in that pull, to feel the sand beneath our feet, to let the wave break and recede without chasing it. This is not an easy thing. It requires the courage to stand in the presence of discomfort without scrambling to cover it. Yet in doing so, something shifts. The shadow comes into view, and in the simple act of seeing it without judgment, its hold weakens. Desire still rises, but it no longer commands us. And in that space, between the wave and our reflex to follow it, we find the first breath of freedom, the kind that is not borrowed from relief, but born from stillness itself, the kind that hints at a life beyond the endless reach of craving. We often imagine that there's a point where striving ends, where the summit is reached, and the air is so pure that dissatisfaction can no longer breathe. It is an image that drives much of human ambition, the belief that beyond a certain threshold of success, wealth, or recognition, we will finally rest in peace of mind. Yet history and the intimate confessions of the world's most celebrated figures tell another story entirely. Sir Isaac Newton, after unveiling the mathematical language of the cosmos and altering humanity's understanding of the physical world, described himself at life's end as a child playing on the seashore, finding a few smooth pebbles while the vast ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. Leonardo da Vinci, whose genius seemed to encompass every field, spoke in his final moments of having offended God and mankind because his work had not reached the quality it should have. These were not men at the foot of the mountain longing for the climb. They had stood on heights few could imagine, and yet their gaze was drawn not to their accomplishments, but to the unfillable space that remained. Blaise Pascal might have called it the God-shaped vacuum in the heart, an emptiness that no created thing can satisfy. The same confession echoes in more recent voices. Steve Jobs, whose vision reshaped technology and culture, spoke in his final days of deep regret for the time he had neglected his family, realizing too late that the warmth of human connection was worth more than the gleam of innovation. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, whose fame and artistic influence reached around the globe, admitted in quieter moments that he was never satisfied with anything he did, driven by a perfectionism that left him in constant hunger for the next performance, the next achievement. From the outside, these lives looked like the pinnacle, the place from which one might survey the world with contentment. But inside, the view was often obscured by the same clouds of longing and incompleteness that drift across every human soul. Teilhard de Chardin envisioned the evolution of consciousness toward the omega point, a unification with the divine where fulfillment would finally be whole. But until that convergence, the human heart remains restless, a truth the Urantia teachings and even the mystical dialogues recounted by Jan Val Elam affirm. No summit reached in the material sphere can resolve the deeper thirst of the soul. There is, however, another kind of summit, one found not in accumulation, but in relinquishment. Figures across traditions have chosen to walk away from the very prizes that the world spends its life pursuing. Princes who became mendicants, leaders who stepped into silence, artists who abandoned the marketplace for the solitude of the spirit. Their renunciation was not a rejection of beauty or talent, but a turning toward a different horizon, one where meaning was measured not by applause, but by alignment with a greater truth. And here lies the paradox. Those who willingly descended from the mountains of fame and power often discovered a clearer view of the infinite than those who remained at the peak. The voices from the summit, whether spoken in the trembling humility of Newton, the self-reproach of Leonardo, the regrets of Jobs, or the restless perfectionism of Jackson, are not failures. They are warnings and perhaps invitations. They remind us that the climb itself, if aimed only at personal glory, ends in a kind of thin air that cannot sustain the soul. The true ascent begins where the world thinks it ends, in a relinquishing of the summit for the open, unmeasured sky beyond. The young Prince Siddhartha had been born into a world designed to keep sorrow at bay. The palace walls were high, its gardens lush, its corridors filled with music and fragrance. His father, fearing a prophecy that the boy would forsake the crown for a spiritual path, ensured that no trace of sickness, aging, or death ever crossed his son's gaze. Inside those walls, pleasure was cultivated like a rare flower, carefully protected from wind and frost. Yet even in this cultivated beauty, a question began to grow in Siddhartha's heart. It was not yet formed into words, but it was a stirring, a sense that the perfection around him was a fragile veil. One day, driven by a curiosity he could not quiet, he ventured beyond the gates and encountered the first of the four sights, an old man, bent and slow, his body marked by the weight of time. In that moment, Siddhartha saw the palace's illusion fracture, for he understood this was the destiny of all youth. On other journeys he met the sick, the dead, and finally a wandering ascetic whose eyes held a calm unlike anything he had seen within the palace. These encounters, simple yet shattering, awakened in him the knowledge that no arrangement of worldly joy could hold back the tides of suffering. Leaving the palace was not a flight from life, but a turning toward its rawest truth. In the deep night, Siddhartha looked upon his sleeping wife and newborn son, and the tenderness he felt for them made his departure all the more painful, for he knew that love, too, was bound to loss. Mounted on his horse, passing unseen through the sleeping city, he shed his ornaments, his silks, his crown, as if removing layer by layer the identities that bound him to the life he was leaving. The world beyond the palace was not the polished stage of his upbringing. It was dust and hunger, the groan of the sick, the silence of the dead. Yet in that starkness, Siddhartha sought not escape, but understanding. He trained under masters, mastered their disciplines, and still felt the quiet persistence of dukkha. He starved his body until it was little more than bone and breath, and there, at the edge of death, realized that neither indulgence nor self-mortification could lead him to the truth. It was then he chose the middle way, a path of balance, neither clinging to pleasure nor denying the needs of the body. Under the Bodhi tree, Siddhartha sat with the stillness of one who has ceased bargaining with life. Mara, the tempter, came with storms, with illusions of fear and desire, with every image that might draw him back into the currents of craving. But Siddhartha touched the earth, calling it as witness to his right to awaken, and the ground itself seemed to hold him steady. In the deep hours of night, visions unfolded before him. The endless cycles of birth and death, the weaving of karma, the ceaseless arising and passing of all things. As dawn broke, he saw not with the eyes of a prince or a seeker, but with the clear sight of the awakened one. What Jesus in the Urantia teachings would later call the will of the Father, Siddhartha knew as the end of dukkha, the liberation of the mind from the grasp of ignorance and craving. Rumi might have said that in that moment, the drop remembered it was the ocean. The man who had been a prince was now the Buddha, and his kingdom was not of golden armies, but of understanding, compassion, and the unshakable peace that arises when one lives in harmony with what is. When the Buddha first spoke of the Four Noble Truths, he offered them not as a creed to be believed, but as a physician might deliver a diagnosis and a path to healing. He began with the truth most prefer to avoid. Dukkha is woven into the fabric of life. It is not only the obvious pain of illness, loss, and death, but also the subtle dissatisfaction that lingers even in moments of joy, the quiet sense that nothing can be held, that change will take even the sweetest things from our hands. Like a fine crack in glass, it is present beneath the surface of every experience. This was not pessimism, it was clarity. As St. Augustine once wrote, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you," speaking to the same unease that drives us to seek endlessly, as if the horizon might one day yield something final and complete. The Buddha's first truth simply placed that restlessness in the light, naming it for what it is so we might no longer run from it unconsciously. From this recognition, the second truth follows. The cause of dukkha is craving, the thirst that pulls us toward what we want, away from what we fear, and into a ceaseless cycle of grasping. This is not only the desire for sensual pleasure, but also the desire for becoming and the desire for non-existence, all rooted in ignorance of impermanence and the true nature of self. Viktor Frankl, through the lens of logotherapy, observed that when life lacks meaning, people will cling to pleasure or power as substitutes, but these never resolve the deeper hunger. Hazrat Inayat Khan, from the Sufi tradition, spoke of the soul's longing as a homesickness for the infinite, a yearning that can only be satisfied when we turn toward its source rather than toward temporary reflections. The Buddha did not condemn desire itself. Without it, no step would be taken, but he revealed that when it is driven by ignorance, it binds us to dissatisfaction. And here, the Urantia teachings align. The evolutionary worlds are schools where imperfect desire is meant to be refined into the will to align with the Creator's purpose, transforming craving into conscious cooperation with the divine plan. The third and fourth truths are the promise and the prescription. The end of dukkha, nirvana, is not a bliss that comes and goes, but a peace that remains because it is no longer dependent on conditions. It is the cooling of the fires of greed, aversion, and delusion, the unbinding of the mind from the compulsions that once ruled it. To reach it, the Buddha offered the Noble Eightfold Path, a practical way of life in which wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline work together to uproot craving at its source. This is the medicine that heals the restlessness Augustine named, the deep alignment with meaning that Frankl saw as essential, the homecoming that Sufi mystics sing of, the cosmic harmony described in Urantia as living in the Father's will. The diagnosis is clear, the cause is known, and the cure is possible. What remains is to walk the path, not in blind hope, but in the quiet confidence of one who knows that freedom is not a gift from the world, but the birthright of every soul that dares to seek it. The Noble Eightfold Path is often portrayed as a wheel, each spoke essential to its strength, each part inseparable from the others. It is not a ladder to climb one rung at a time, but a way of walking in which wisdom, ethics, and mental clarity are cultivated together, moment by moment. The Buddha described it as the middle way, a path of balance between the indulgence that clouds the mind and the self-denial that stars it. Thich Nhat Hanh taught that mindfulness is the thread that stitches these elements into the fabric of daily life, allowing us to move through the world with awareness, kindness, and steadiness. William James, from a different tradition, recognized that the quality of our attention shapes the quality of our lives, and that cultivating focused, intentional awareness is not a luxury, but a discipline. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, might have nodded in agreement, for to him, freedom was not the absence of hardship, but the mastery of one's own responses, aligning action with virtue regardless of circumstance. To walk this path is not to withdraw from life, but to engage with it more deeply. Right view asks us to see the impermanence of all things and to remember that our actions ripple outward into the lives of others. Right intention urges us to release ill will and replace it with goodwill and harmlessness. Right speech reminds us that our words can wound or heal, that silence can be as powerful as speaking, and that truth delivered with compassion is a force for transformation. Right action grounds these insights in the body, guiding us toward choices that respect life and integrity. Right livelihood invites us to consider whether the work that sustains us also sustains the greater web of life, or whether it frays it for personal gain. Right effort is the ongoing cultivation of the mind's garden, nurturing seeds of patience and generosity while pulling out weeds of greed and resentment. Right mindfulness keeps us awake to the reality unfolding in each moment, and right concentration gathers the scattered rays of attention into a steady flame. None of these are abstract ideals. They are practices that can be folded into the most ordinary moments: washing dishes, speaking to a stranger, signing a contract, or sitting quietly in the early morning. When lived fully, the Eightfold Path is less a set of rules than the rhythm of a life aligned with reality. The mystics have long seen it as more than a moral code. It is a cosmic wheel turning in harmony with the deeper order of the universe. In the Urantia vision, such alignment is nothing less than participation in the will of the Father, an integration of human choice with divine purpose. To live in this way is to step into a current that carries you beyond the restless search for satisfaction into the steadier waters of peace. The wheel does not turn because we push it once and walk away. It turns because each day we choose, again and again, to see clearly, to act with care, to speak with truth, to work with integrity, to attend to what is real. In this steady turning, the path becomes not something we walk upon, but the shape of our very being, and freedom is no longer a distant shore but the ground under our feet. Between heaven and earth there exists a space where the stories of our world touch the vast architecture of the cosmos. The life of the Buddha, seen through the lens of Urantia, is not merely the solitary journey of a prince who awakened under a tree, but a chapter in an unfolding planetary mission that stretches across millennia. The Urantia revelation speaks of such figures as part of a lineage of luminous beings, each sent in a particular time and place to ignite a flame suited to that era's spiritual hunger. These are not accidents of history, but coordinated moments in the curriculum of an evolving world. Helena Blavatsky hinted at this in her own esoteric writings. the idea of a brotherhood of teachers, human and superhuman, whose influence flows beneath the surface of civilizations, sometimes quietly, sometimes as a torrent. Gurdjieff, in his own cryptic way, spoke of the work that is not confined to one lifetime, suggesting that the conscious efforts of certain individuals resonate far beyond their personal existence. In this view, the Buddha's compassion and clarity are part of a chain, an unbroken current linking worlds, ages, and hierarchies of beings. The Urantia narrative situates Earth, Urantia, as a world with a turbulent history, one that has required special interventions to correct its course. Such interventions are not simply the arrival of wisdom, but the embodiment of it in a living example, tailored to the cultural, philosophical, and spiritual language of a people. Siddhartha Gautama's life became such a living testament, offering a map out of suffering at a time when the Indian subcontinent was fertile with philosophical questioning. In the same cosmic ledger, other figures emerge: Melchizedek's, Adamic uplifters, Michael Bestowal's, each serving a purpose that transcends the boundaries of religion and history. The Buddha's role was not to replace the truths that came before him, nor to end the work of those who would come after, but to anchor a dimension of understanding without which the human spirit could not progress. He was, in mystical terms, a bridge, his feet planted firmly in the human condition, his mind open to the structure of reality as it is known in the higher spheres. From the mists of Shambhala to the celestial councils described in Urantia, the chain of masters can be imagined as a river flowing through many lands, sometimes visible in the sunlight, sometimes running underground. Each master draws from its source, and each contributes to its course, carrying forward the great work of awakening the human family to its place in the universe. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence, compassion, and liberation were not isolated insights, but part of a universal grammar of enlightenment, spoken differently on different worlds. To see him in this light is to see that we are never alone in our seeking, that between heaven and earth there is always a transmission, a call, a hand extended from beyond the visible. And perhaps it is this very awareness, more than any single teaching, that begins to lift the mind from the narrow confines of the present moment into the wide, star-filled expanse where the soul remembers its origin and its destiny. The deeper we look into the nature of reality, the more it resists the neat boundaries our minds try to draw around it. The old certainty that matter is the foundation of all things has begun to dissolve, replaced by the strange revelations of quantum physics, where particles seem to exist as probabilities until observed, and where the act of observation itself alters what is seen. Amit Goswami and other pioneers in the science of consciousness have dared to suggest that mind, not matter, may be the ground of being, that the universe is not a machine we inhabit, but a living field in which our awareness participates. This mirrors the Urantia teaching that consciousness is not an accident of matter, but a spark of the divine, an intentional endowment from the Universal Father. In this view, to know oneself deeply is not merely a matter of self-reflection. It is an act of aligning with the very source that breathes reality into existence. The quest to understand consciousness becomes inseparable from the quest to understand the cosmos, for they may be, at the deepest level, two sides of the same reality. Experiences at the edge of life often illuminate this connection in ways theory cannot. Near-death experiences, like those recounted by Howard Storm, reveal a continuity of awareness beyond the physical body, and in many cases, a profound encounter with a presence described as pure love and intelligence. Such testimonies, while varied in detail, share an unmistakable quality: the sense of returning to something more real than the world left behind, and of carrying back a fragment of that reality into ordinary life. Rupert Sheldrake's concept of morphic resonance suggests that memory itself may be a cosmic phenomenon, that patterns of form and thought are stored not solely in individual brains, but in a shared field accessible across time and space. If so, each moment of insight, each act of love, may ripple outward into this field, subtly shaping the evolution of consciousness not only on our planet, but across the vast community of worlds. The mysteries of the self and the mysteries of the cosmos begin to blur, hinting at a profound reciprocity. The universe is within us as much as we are within the universe. To live with this awareness is to step into a larger frame of purpose. The search for meaning is no longer confined to the boundaries of a single lifetime or a single world. It becomes part of the unfolding of a cosmic story in which each soul is both a chapter and a co-author. The Urantia perspective reminds us that our minds are designed to be more than instruments for survival. They're bridges to the eternal, capable of receiving and transmitting the currents of divine thought. Science, spirituality, and mystery converge in this recognition, not as competing explanations, but as facets of one truth, that to know oneself is to begin to know the whole. And perhaps this is why the ancient injunction to know thyself has echoed across so many cultures and ages. For in answering that call, we do not merely solve the riddle of our own existence. We begin to awaken to the infinite depth and wonder of the cosmos itself. There's a kind of silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and whole. It is the silence Lao Tzu pointed toward when he said that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, a recognition that the deepest truths are not carried on the tongue, but felt in the marrow of being. This silence does not argue, does not persuade, does not need to prove. It simply is like the open sky holding every kind of weather without strain. Thomas Merton described it as the one place where we cannot lie to ourselves, for in silence there is nothing to hide behind. When a noise of thought settles, even for a breath, we glimpse that the mind's constant commentary is not reality itself, but a veil drawn across it. Ramana Maharshi went further, teaching that the highest form of teaching is not through words, but through the silent transmission of presence, where the self recognizes itself without the interference of concepts. To enter such silence is to step into a landscape without roads or boundaries. Meditation, contemplation, solitude. These are not escapes from the world, but doorways into its most essential nature. The cessation of mental noise is not an erasure of thought, but a release of its tyranny, a loosening of the grip that compels us to chase every fragment that passes through the mind. In the stillness, we discover that awareness itself is already complete, already whole, needing nothing added to be at peace. The mystics have long said that silence is the language of God, and perhaps this is why. For in silence we are no longer translating the infinite into the small grammar of human speech, but resting directly in its presence. The Urantia teachings echo this in their own way, reminding us that communion with the divine often arrives not in grand visions or voices, but in the quiet turning of the heart toward the source. When we allow silence to contain us, the boundaries between seeker and sought begin to dissolve. The restless search for meaning gives way to a kind of listening that is itself the answer. In this listening, the world becomes vivid. The light through a leaf, the breath rising and falling, the subtle hum of existence itself. Nothing has changed, yet everything is seen anew, as if the stillness has washed the dust from our eyes. This is not a state to cling to or measure. For the moment we try to hold it, the mind returns to its familiar grasping. Rather, it is a space we return to again and again, until it becomes less a practice than a way of being. And in that way of being, we begin to understand that the silence which contains all things also contains us, and that to dwell there is to remember what we have always been. To live without chains does not mean to abandon the world, but to no longer be bound by its invisible cords. These cords are not always the obvious restraints of oppression or law. More often, they're the subtler bindings of habit, fear, and the unexamined need for approval. Krishnamurti spoke of freedom as a state without psychological dependence, not in rebellion against the world, but in seeing it clearly enough that it can no longer dictate the contours of your inner life. In the Roman streets of another age, Seneca advised that the truly free person is one who serves willingly, not out of compulsion, but from the abundance of their own mind. The Urantia perspective echoes this in its highest form. Life, rightly lived, is a joyous act of service, not a transaction in pursuit of reward. To walk in such freedom is not to flee the marketplace, but to move through it without selling your soul for its coins. Simplicity, in this light, is not deprivation, but the deliberate shedding of what no longer serves. In a world that urges us to consume endlessly, voluntary simplicity is an act of quiet rebellion, not for its own sake, but for the space it creates in the heart. Matthew Ricard calls this inner wealth, a mind unburdened by the excess that distracts it from what truly matters. It might mean choosing a smaller home so that time and resources can be freed for meaningful work, or turning down a promotion that would fracture the rhythm of family life, or resisting the lure of possessions that only momentarily soothe the hunger for significance. In each case, the outer choice is secondary to the inner stance, the refusal to let external measures of worth define the value of one's life. Freedom here is not an escape from responsibility, but a liberation into the kind of responsibility one chooses, the responsibility to nurture, to create, to uplift. The paradox is that when we stop chasing happiness as a possession, it begins to arise naturally as a companion. Joy becomes not a prize to be hoarded, but the quiet radiance of a life aligned with its own values. The man who spends his weekends mentoring children instead of climbing the corporate ladder may not fit the conventional image of success, yet his days are threaded with a satisfaction no title could confer. The woman who turns her garden into a source of food for her neighbors may find more meaning in those shared meals than in any luxury she could purchase. These are lives lived without chains, where joy flows as the byproduct of service, simplicity, and inner clarity. The Urantia teachings remind us that such living is not only possible, but is the very reason we are here. To embody the freedom of a soul aligned with the Creator's will, moving through the world as a quiet blessing. In such a life, the world does not lose its color or texture. It becomes more vivid, more alive, because we're no longer looking at it from behind the bars we once mistook for our home. The roots of suffering reach deeper than most of us realize, threading through places we cannot see and histories we do not remember. What we experience as personal pain often carries the echoes of older wounds, the inherited sorrows of our families, the unresolved traumas of cultures, even the silent imprint of events that shaped the consciousness of our species long before our birth. Jung called this the collective unconscious, a reservoir of archetypes, memories, and instincts that influence us without our awareness. Within it lie the patterns of love and fear, hope and despair, that have been repeated through generations. Rupert Sheldrake's concept of morphic resonance suggests that each thought, each action, each choice leaves a trace in a shared field, subtly shaping what will be possible for others to feel or imagine. The Urantia perspective widens this field even further, framing human consciousness as part of a planetary tapestry where the evolution of one mind participates in the slow awakening of the whole world. Seen in this way, suffering is not only an individual condition, but a networked reality. Its architecture built over centuries, spanning heaven and earth. The conditioning that binds us is often so pervasive we mistake it for the way things are. From the moment we are born, we are trained to value certain dreams, to fear certain losses, to follow certain paths, as if the map were already drawn before we took our first breath. This conditioning is reinforced by the voices of our ancestors, not always through words, but through the tone of their lives, the sacrifices they made, the fears they carried, the hopes they dared or did not dare to pursue. Some of these inheritances are blessings, but others are chains forged from grief unhealed. Entire societies can be caught in these invisible loops, reenacting the same conflicts, making the same mistakes, longing for the same unattainable visions. Helena Blavatsky hinted at this when she spoke of the karma of nations, the collective lessons that peoples must learn before they can move forward. And the Urantia Book offers a similar insight. Worlds, like souls, have their own evolutionary struggles, shaped by both their celestial history and their own free will. To see suffering in this light is to recognize that liberation is never purely personal. It is an act that ripples through the collective field. When we begin to notice these patterns, we step into a different kind of responsibility. To heal ourselves is to participate in the healing of something far larger, just as to remain unconscious is to contribute to the inertia of the collective. Gurdjieff described humanity as asleep, dreaming its individual dreams while sharing the same collective slumber. To awaken, then, is to withdraw one's energy from the architecture that sustains unnecessary suffering, to refuse to feed the structures of greed, hatred, and ignorance that have been passed down through ages. It is also to become a point of light within the network, subtly shifting the balance toward clarity and compassion. Each act of forgiveness loosens a knot that may have been tightening for generations. Each moment of conscious choice weakens the invisible blueprint of pain. In this way, the hidden architecture of suffering can be dismantled, not through grand revolutions, but through the quiet, steady work of those who dare to see it and refuse to keep building it. And in that refusal, something begins to change, not only in us, but in the unseen structure of the world itself. Transformation begins in the furnace of our own discomfort, where the familiar self is melted down and remade into something both ancient and new. The alchemists of old, draped in the symbols of fire and metal, spoke in veiled language of turning lead into gold, but their true work was never about precious metals. It was about the transmutation of the human soul, the slow refinement of what is dense, reactive, and unconscious into what is luminous, stable, and awake. Jung understood this when he saw in alchemical texts a mirror of individuation, the process by which the disparate fragments of the self are brought into union, not by suppressing the shadow, but by embracing and integrating it. In the spiritual laboratory of life, every challenge becomes a crucible, every loss a catalyst. The Urantia teachings remind us that such transformation is not an accident of fate, but part of the intended arc of mortal experience. Imperfect beginnings refine toward divine likeness through choice, courage, and love. The work is both subtle and relentless. It begins when we turn inward, not in self-absorption, but in honest encounter with what we truly are, the fears we have hidden, the desires we have denied, the wounds we have carried as if they were part of our identity. Paracelsus wrote that the physician must first heal himself, for only then can he become a true instrument of healing for others. The same holds for the alchemist of the spirit. One cannot transmute what one refuses to touch. In the language of transformation, the nigredo, the blackening, is the stage where the old structures of self crumble, where we are stripped of false certainties and left in the fertile darkness of not knowing. From here, through patience and perseverance, the albedo, the whitening, emerges a cleansing that clarifies our motives and restores a sense of purpose. Finally, the rubedo, the reddening, seals the transformation as the self, now whole, returns to the world not as it was, but as a living vessel for light. Mystics across traditions agree that the true alchemy is not escape, but embodiment. It is not about leaving the world behind, but about moving through it with a new constitution, a heart that cannot be hardened by fear, a mind that cannot be deceived by illusion, a spirit that is attuned to the quiet hum of the infinite in every moment. Gurdjieff spoke of the need to crystallize the higher self, to make it stable and enduring amid the impermanence of all else. In the same way, the alchemist learns to hold steady in the heat of life, neither clinging to pleasure nor recoiling from pain, knowing both are part of the great distillation. The gold that emerges is not an object to be displayed, but a state of being, a consciousness so aligned with the source that it radiates clarity, compassion, and unshakable peace. This is the philosopher's stone hidden in plain sight, not in vaults or laboratories, but in the hearts of those willing to pass through the fire and let it do its work. The narrow bridge stretches between two worlds, one we know too well, woven of habits, fears, and the gravitational pull of the familiar, and one that calls to us with the quiet certainty of something more real, more whole. To walk it is to live in both at once, balancing the demands of the outer life with the inner call to awakening. The sages have always warned that this bridge is not for the distracted or the divided, for its path demands vigilance. Gurdjieff spoke of the necessity of remembering oneself, even in the midst of life's noise, of keeping a part of one's awareness free from the mechanical reactions that dominate most of human activity. Epictetus would say that freedom is found not in avoiding the storms, but in learning to steer one's vessel by the stars, even when the waves rise high. And in the heart of the Urantia teachings lies the same truth. The goal is not to flee the arena of the world, but to stand within it as a conscious participant in the divine plan, grounded in the eternal even as we move through the temporary. This balancing act is not an abstract metaphor, but a daily discipline. It might mean pausing to breathe before answering an email that stirs irritation, or holding to integrity when compromise would bring faster reward. It might mean listening deeply to another person's pain while keeping enough of your own center to respond with compassion rather than being swept away by the emotion. The narrow bridge is the space where the principles we admire become the actions we embody, where the teachings of mindfulness, virtue, and spiritual presence are tested in the friction of ordinary life. Thich Nhat Hanh would remind us that the present moment is our only point of contact with reality, and that each step, literal or figurative, is an opportunity to walk with the peace we seek. The path is narrow not because it excludes the world, but because it refuses to allow us to wander mindlessly on either side. And yet, the bridge is also a place of wonder. From its height, one sees both the terrain left behind and the horizon ahead, realizing they are connected by more than the bridge itself. They are stages of the same journey. The mystics have long spoken of this in terms of initiation, the passage from one state of being to another, guided by the unseen but deeply felt presence of the divine. On the narrow bridge, joy arises not from reaching the end, but from the act of walking itself. Each step a conversation between heaven and earth. The Urantia vision expands this to a cosmic scale. Each human life is a bridge between the material and the spiritual, each choice a plank laid down for those who will follow. To walk here is to know that the journey is not yours alone, and that the steadiness you cultivate under your own feet may one day carry another soul across. Across the long corridors of human history, certain figures stand like beacons, their light reaching far beyond the boundaries of their own time. Some are well known: the Buddha, Jesus, Lao Tzu, Socrates, Francis of Assisi, names that echo across cultures and centuries. Others have moved in relative obscurity, their influence carried in whispers, in manuscripts hidden in monasteries, in quiet acts of transformation that never reached the chronicles of history. The Urantia teachings present these beings not as isolated prodigies of wisdom, but as coordinated points of light in the cosmic plan, emissaries of truth whose lives were interwoven with a larger arc of planetary evolution. Helena Blavatsky hinted at this hidden order, describing a fraternity of masters who safeguard and transmit knowledge when the world is ready to receive it. Seen from the human view, they appear scattered across time. Seen from the higher vantage, they form a constellation, each star contributing to a greater pattern of guidance. These messengers did not arrive to impose a single doctrine, but to awaken in their time the truths most needed for that stage of humanity's growth. Jesus came not to erase the insights of those before him, but to fulfill and expand them, just as the Buddha's teachings on liberation deepened the soil into which later revelations would be planted. Socrates' relentless questioning loosened the grip of unexamined beliefs. Lao Tzu's verses pointed toward a harmony beyond striving. Francis of Assisi embodied a love for all creation that transcended the hierarchies of his age. And there were others, less remembered, prophets in forgotten villages, mystics who left no name, sages whose words survive only as fragments in the writings of their students. The Urantia vision affirms that no age is without its teachers, and that some of the most potent work is done far from the spotlight, where a single life lived in truth can tilt the balance of a whole community toward the good. To recognize this lineage is to see ourselves not as isolated seekers, but as inheritors of a vast treasury of insight. The thread that binds these messengers is not cultural uniformity, but fidelity to the source, a willingness to be shaped into instruments for the transmission of light. In this sense, each of us is a potential link in that chain, not by imitating the outer forms of the great ones, but by listening for and living out the particular truth entrusted to us. The Urantia teachings invite us to think of revelation not as a closed book, but as an ongoing dialogue between heaven and earth, with new chapters still being written. The question is never whether messengers will come. They always do. But whether we will recognize them, and whether we will have the courage to let their light illuminate our own path. For in the great continuum of time, the role of the messenger is not to stand apart, but to call us to remember that the same fire burns within us, waiting for the moment we dare to carry it forward. In the end, all roads lead back to the silence from which they began. It is not the silence of absence or emptiness, but the fullness that exists before words, before thought, before the division between self and world. The mystics have always known this, though they used different names. the Tao of Lao Tzu, the cloud of unknowing in Christian mysticism, the stillness of the heart in Sufism. The Urantia teachings point to the same truth in their own way, describing a soul that, after its long journey through the material and the morontial worlds, finds its final rest in the embrace of the Universal Father. This is the great silence, the place where all striving ceases, not because the search failed, but because it has been fulfilled. Every question has returned to its source. Every longing has resolved into the single knowing that there is nothing to reach, only to be. The return to this silence is not the erasure of our humanity, but its completion. We do not lose what we have lived. Rather, the essence of every moment is gathered and transfigured, like a melody that becomes more beautiful when it resolves into its final chord. In this silence, there is no need to hold on to joy or to push away pain, for both are understood as notes in the same song. It is here that the dualities collapse, life and death, gain and loss, seeker and sought, revealing themselves as movements within a stillness that has never been disturbed. Ramana Maharshi described this as abiding in the self, a resting so profound that it is untouched by the rise and fall of experience. In such rest, there is no fear of change, for the one who abides knows that all change happens within that which does not change. And yet, the great silence is not only a final destination. It is present even now, beneath the noise of our restless minds. To return to it at the end of the journey is to recognize that it was with us all along, the constant background against which every scene of our life has unfolded. To live with this awareness is to walk in the world without being bound by it, to speak without leaving the quiet, to act without disturbing the stillness within. The Urantia vision reminds us that our purpose is not only to reach the Father in the far future, but to begin aligning with His presence here, in the middle of our days, in the midst of our ordinary choices. In that alignment, the great silence becomes not an escape from life, but the heartbeat of life itself, the quiet pulse of eternity carrying us forward until the final embrace, where all journeys end and all beginnings are made new. From the first breath to the last, life is a movement between forgetting and remembering, forgetting what we are, and then, through countless experiences, remembering again. Along the way, we chase dreams, gather knowledge, win battles, and endure losses, only to discover that the treasure we sought has been quietly waiting in the center of our being. The Buddha called it the end of dukkha, the cessation of the restless craving that keeps us wandering. The Urantia teachings describe it as the alignment of the human will with the will of the Father, a harmony so complete that the soul moves as one with the source. Whether we speak of enlightenment, salvation, liberation, or homecoming, the essence is the same. The discovery that we were never separate, never abandoned, never truly lost. Looking back from this point, the steps of the journey reveal their purpose. The illusions we dismantled were the scaffolding that allowed us to climb high enough to see beyond them. The suffering we endured was the heat that shaped us into vessels able to hold greater light. The teachers and messengers who appeared along the way were not accidents, but part of a vast and benevolent design, weaving each life into the tapestry of a world still finding its way. Even our own mistakes, once seen through the eyes of wisdom, become threads of gold in the pattern. The evidence that grace works not by erasing what is flawed, but by transforming it into something that serves the whole. Now, at the close of this path, or perhaps at the opening of another, the invitation is clear. We are called not merely to admire the vision of freedom, but to embody it, not to revere the eightfold path, the words of sages, or the revelations of the cosmos as distant ideals, but to let them become the way we speak, the way we choose, the way we live. The world does not need more voices shouting about what is wrong. It needs more lives quietly aligned with what is true. And so, step by step, we take the path that has been shown to us, knowing that each act of kindness, each moment of awareness, each choice to serve is a turning of the great wheel that carries all of us forward. And if you enjoyed this content, please comment where you're from, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel. Every day we bring new videos to nourish the soul.